like the Western European countries. And that was formalized in that acquis communautaire of the European community, which then became the European Union, that the countries of the former Soviet area would adopt the laws, standards, conventions, and so forth of the European community at the time. So that's what I argued for. That's what I recommended. And I think, broadly speaking, it came to pass. The one thing that did not come to pass was that I believed in what Mikhail Gorbachev was saying at the end of the 1980s, which is that this common European space should extend to Russia and should extend to the former Soviet Union. And indeed, that there should be a common home between Rotterdam and Vladivostok, as Gorbachev put it. Of course, that not only did not happen, we're in the middle of a war, which is the contradiction of that. And so the early period and today are very much related. I believe then, I still believe today, that there should be peace and normal relations across the large expanse of Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union. And this is what I still don't give up on, even though this is not the vision of the United States or of the European Union right now.
You are primarily a professor of economy. And if you have a look on the actual situation of the economies in the Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Poland, Hungary, and so on, you may agree with me that the results of that transformation are not identical with the initial plans. What is your opinion upon this issue?
Well, I just looked at the data again to see where things stand. And a good source is the International Monetary Fund data, which is systematic and available and comparative. So one can look at the World Economic Outlook. If you look back to the late 1980s, for example, in Poland, where the data exists basically from the 1980s onward, Poland's per capita income or per capita output was about 1/3 of Germany's level at the end of the 1980s. Now it's about 70%. So there's been a very substantial narrowing of the gap of income. The Czech Republic was always richer than Poland, and that was true from the 1920s onward. Czechoslovakia was a quite industrialized, high technology economy pre-World War II. But also, of course, the data are not easy to get exactly because of the division of Czechoslovakia. But let's just say, starting in 1995, according to the IMF data, the Czech Republic was about 50% of the German level per capita. Now it's about 70-some percent, 75% or so. So there's been a convergence of income levels, not complete, but convergence. And this is true pretty much across the board. Romania really caught up a lot. Slovakia really caught up a lot. It's important to remember, and I'm sure everybody does, of the right age like us, that in the 1980s, the Central European countries were far behind technologically and in living standards of Western Europe. And in some cases, especially in Poland, were in a catastrophic mess, actually, a huge debt crisis.
That's true.
And so forth. So I think what we've seen is a lot of convergence. Of course, Prague is, a touristic boom city of the world. And but it's not completely even convergence. There's a general principle that the closer one is to the German economy during the period after 1989, the higher the living standards and the faster convergence, generally because the German industrial base up until recently has been the main motor of growth of Europe as a whole. And that's been true of Central Europe and Eastern Europe, a lot related, of course, to the German automotive industry. Now there's more of a crisis, so it's the situation is not so good, and it's related also to the war in Ukraine, which has really broken a lot of economic relations, and that's, I'd say, hurting Europe generally. But if you look over the long period, the thing that I wrote about in the late 1980s and early 1990s was two ideas. One was there should be normal economy, and what that would mean is that Central and Eastern Europe institutionally would look a lot more like Western Europe, because the Eastern and Central European Soviet system was a failure, and it was going to be overhauled in the direction of the institutions of Western Europe. Second, there would be a convergence of income levels. And both are true. The convergence has been substantial but incomplete, and again, very much dependent on geography. The further east, the less the convergence in general.
Here we can have a long debate, and I can quote other, let's say, figures. I don't know whether you know that, for instance, Czech Republic reached the level of GDP from the end of the 80s only in the year 2004, which is obviously not a success. And at the same time, Czechoslovakia and even the Czech parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire since, say, last decades of the 19th century were regarded as an industrial heart of the monarchy. And since that time till the 80s, we developed as a country, let's say, as a sort of a sovereign actor in the Champions League, let's say, of international, global industrial markets. We were, let's say, exporting dozens of very advanced technologies, investment, let's say, complexes, leaders in many, let's say, industrial fields, which is not the case at let's say, at the moment. While, yeah, we are, for instance, through the cars like Skoda, Volkswagen, yeah, we are successful. But most of the let's say, fields and companies and so on, which were independent and sovereign in the international markets and generating a lot of, let's say, good incomes for the whole of the country, they are in the foreign hands. It does not. It's not, let's say, owned by Czechs, be it the state, be it the private, let's say, companies, private owners, and we feel repercussions of all of this. I don't know whether you had a chance to study that part of the picture of today.
I haven't. I don't know the Czech situation in detail. I advised Poland, much more intensively. Mm-hmm. In Poland, I don't think there's any doubt that living standards substantially increased. Poland, of course, was not Czechoslovakia, and it was very different back in the 1910s and 1920s. It was much more rural, much more peasant, much less advanced industrial. So I can't really say categorically. I think it's true. I believe it's the case that in the Czech Republic, living standards have increased. Convergence with living standards in Austria or Germany have occurred, not completely, but substantially. But I think what is also true is that at the advanced levels of an economy like Czech Republic, a lot depends, like you say, on innovation, on the quality of higher education, on new startup businesses, and so forth. I'm not enough familiar with the scene to really give you any sophisticated rendition of that. All I would say is certainly the potential for that is much higher now than it was in 1990. Whether the government's policies are adequate to promote that kind of innovation-led development is, really a national question as well as a European-wide question.
Maybe we can agree upon the other element or pillar of all of this. We are much less independent, and we are, let's say, milked to this or that extent by foreign capital. And it has not only economic and social repercussions, but also it has to do something with the capability of the country of a sovereign development. There is, infrastructure and all of this. There is a big internal debt in this respect. Would you have a recommendation how to withstand better the power play of the big sharks from abroad?
Oh, I think, again, being part of a larger world economy is inevitable because no country can do anything on its own. I think the big mistake that Europe is making, the overwhelming mistake that Europe is making right now, is the war with Russia, the breaking of relations with Russia, the complete subservience to U.S. policy, which I find absurd and very, very bad for Europe. And at a national level, no doubt the quality of higher education and the scientific community is essential. Why was Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia more productive a century ago relative to its neighbors? Because it was a very innovative, technologically sophisticated society, very strong education. Charles University played a deep historic role in the country. Engineering was at a very advanced level. And that's the key. That's what's needed anywhere.
This was the core of my question to you. How to come back to that much more successful, trajectory of development based on our own scientific and educational and other resources, which traditionally were very strong. And now somehow it's not the case so much.
I do think absolutely. You look at even tiny countries like Singapore, which has a much higher living standard than the Czech Republic right now. Mm-hmm. Why? Lee Kuan Yew, who led the country, was absolutely convinced already from the 1960s onward, be at the top of the education game. Mm-hmm. Established national universities, advanced science and technology programs, be at the cutting edge. And this is what I expect of the Czech Republic, actually, because that's the tradition. I expect Charles University to be one of the world's leading universities. It should be, and this should be the focus of the government. It should be the focus of the development strategy, a knowledge-led, science-led development. And by the way, you always had strong neighbors. The Hungarians produced lots of great scientists, some of the greatest. I mean, they became
Oh, yeah.
American Hungarian scientists
That's
that
true.
invented the computer age, like von Neumann.
Yeah.
And this tradition needs to be reestablished. Absolutely. Tourism is nice, but it's not going to produce that kind of economy. The kind of economy that people want is produced with innovation, technology, and a major effort in that direction. I thought the Visegrad countries would do that, actually, because Poland also has its scientific traditions. It was a leader in mathematical areas a century ago. And there are a lot of universities and institutions that could team up for this kind of innovative area. It's not good enough to rely on being a supplier to German industry. And by the way, it's even worse now because German industry is in crisis. And so this is leading to a more general crisis in Central Europe. This is why this whole US NATO-led approach is wrong.
Exactly. Let me turn the page a little bit. I don't know whether you will agree or not, but I think that till the end of the 80s, both Europe and the entire globe somehow were more safe than they are today. What's your opinion upon the chance to create a needed security architecture, guaranteeing equal and indivisible security to all powers, and not only, obviously, to all countries? Can it be designed and introduced?
Of course. In fact, it exists, although it's almost dead, and that's the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, had exactly the right idea. First, collective security. Second, security that included not just Western, Central, and Eastern Europe, but the full European region, including the former Soviet area. Third, collective security, because it's a core principle of OSCE that no country can aim for security at the expense of any other. This is completely different from the US mentality. The US mentality is us versus them. We are the good guys, they're the enemies, and we need to expand our bloc. And of course, this goes back to the same period we were discussing, 1989 and 90. The reason I got involved was I liked what Gorbachev was saying, which was let's end the Cold War and make a common European space. And of course, when the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, and Kohl wanted to reunify Germany, Gorbachev said, okay, we'll support that. We'll end the Cold War. We'll even end the Warsaw Pact military, but don't take advantage of this. And two of the leading foreign ministers of the time, our Secretary of State, James Baker III, and German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, promised explicitly to Gorbachev repeatedly, not in vague terms, but repeatedly, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward as a result of this. We will not take advantage of the Soviet Union. And when Yeltsin came to power, Clinton said the same thing. Now, it turned out it was a lie of the Americans because already by 1992, the Americans were promoting NATO expansion secretly. By the mid-1990s, Clinton signed off on NATO enlargement. The Czech Republic was one of the first three, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in 1999. But it didn't end there because the U.S. strategy was to continue to expand NATO not only to Central Europe, which Russia was not happy about, but was not profoundly unhappy because the Czech Republic does not border Russia, and this was not a deep security issue. But it was a lie and it was a cheat. But then in 2004, Bush Jr. expanded NATO to 7 more countries, and this time it was the 3 Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. It was 2 countries on the Black Sea, Bulgaria and Romania, and it was 2 Balkans countries. It was Slovakia and Slovenia, actually. So that was 2004. Then Gorbachev said in 2007, stop, no more. And,
Putin, you said Gorbachev. Putin said it.
I'm sorry, Putin. Excuse me. Yes. Thank you for correcting me. But Putin was just channeling Gorbachev. Gorbachev had said the same thing. So Putin said at the Munich Security Conference, "You cheated, you lied, you told us no expansion. Stop now." Now, George W. Bush Jr. was not the brightest president we ever had, and his vice president was really absolutely one of the worst politicians we ever had in the United States, Dick Cheney. And they decided in 2008 to expand NATO to include Ukraine and Georgia. This is an old idea. It actually goes back to Palmerston in Britain in the 1850s. Surround Russia in the Black Sea.
Exactly.
And Brzezinski had the same idea in the 1990s. So they decided to play out this scenario. This is the U.S. security state. We can trounce Russia. Russia's a second-rate country. Maybe it will even break apart, because that was also part of the deep state plan that since the Soviet Union had disintegrated, well, Russia would also disintegrate. And they even talked openly, these politicians in Washington, about a European Russia, Siberian Russia, and Far Eastern Russia as 3 separate entities. Well, I don't think the Russians like this very much. This was taken as a direct threat to Russian security. And at the same time, the United States abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002, and it started to place Aegis anti-ballistic missiles in Poland and Romania starting in 2010. And Russia said, look, that's a few minutes from Moscow. What the hell are you doing? You're directly threatening us. NATO enlargement, missile placements. This is supposed to be the end of the Cold War. It's the opposite. And then in 2014, the United States worked with really right-wing Ukrainian paramilitaries to overthrow the Ukrainian government in February 2014. So this was a coup in broad daylight that the United States actively abetted and supported. And for Russia, this is just completely a threat to Russian security. So we laugh at Russia. Oh, we're peace-loving. Well, the United States isn't peace-loving, it's power-loving. And the United States wanted to expand NATO. It overthrows governments. It expands its military placements. This is NATO. NATO is not an alliance. NATO is a U.S.-led military operation. And Russia said no. So the war started with Ukraine 10 years ago, and it's been escalating since then. And it's extremely dangerous.
Well, thank you very much. Of course, these are topics that have very long histories and deep roots. And I would probably note 1,000 years, 500 years, 200 years, 75 years as intervals that are relevant for us. 1,000 years ago, the religious wars between Christianity and Islam started with the Crusades in 1095. This gave a certain culture and self-consciousness to Europe as Christendom. and Christendom that would free the Holy Land, Christendom that would confront the Christian non-believers, the reconquest of Spain in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, and so on. 15th century was similar. The second phase of this creation of Western political culture came with the discovery, conquest, and settlement of the Americas. This was one of the most decisive events in human history, starting with the Columbus's voyage and also with the European presence in Asia. This gave a self-consciousness to Europe as Christendom and increasingly a racial awareness as Europe created a slave system with more than 10 million Africans transported in the so-called Middle Passage to the Americas to settle the Americas as a slave-holding system of Europe. The third phase, I would say, is starting with the Industrial Revolution and the industrial dominance of Europe over Asia in the 19th century, and of course the complete conquest of Africa in the second half of the 19th century and much of Asia at the same time. This gave rise to still more theories. Of course, Christian superiority was always one of them. White superiority was also very clear. Race became a very conscious quasi-scientific or pseudo-scientific factor, starting with the Enlightenment, and then in the 19th century, most of the philosophers of the 19th century took it for granted that Europe was genetically superior. And then with Darwin, this was given an added scientific edge. Darwin himself argued in The Descent of Man that in 1871 that yes, the savages were humans, because that was debated, but they were lower humans, and they would go extinct, actually, just like the great apes would go extinct over time. This became core to what became the Nazi ideology in the 20th century, but Nazi ideology was firmly grounded on the science of the day in Germany and German evolutionary thought. And so you had genetic superiority, racial superiority, cultural superiority, Christian superiority, and some of the more moderate philosophers of the 19th century, like John Stuart Mill, said, well, it's probably not genetic, but it is cultural, it's deep. Europe has a vocation to bring the rest of civilization into true civilization. This, of course, was taken up in French ideology, in ideology across Europe. Then the last phase, I would say, is the 75 years that I mentioned, basically since the end of World War II, when the United States, which is an Anglo-Saxon culture, a very racially oriented society. Remember, North America slaughtered the indigenous populations, committed multiple genocides, enslaved African Americans, and ran an apartheid system for a century after the end of the Civil War. The U.S. became the dominant power in the world, very much learning from Britain, so it's a very Anglo-Saxon empire. Europe receded in a way during this period and seemed to have learned a lot, except I'm not so sure now in recent events how much Europe has learned, because it still has its deep cultural biases and proclivities that we see manifest right now, for example, in the wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East. So all of this is to say there are very deep roots of European felt superiority. This became Anglo-Saxonized in the 19th century when Britain became the dominant power of the world. The Anglo-Saxon tradition continued with the United States being the dominant power in the world. And where do we see it manifest? Well, with the rise of China and the spread of technology and the evening out of power in a lot of ways, including the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which is an equalizer in its horrible way, this superiority of the West, which was always a noxious idea, is directly challenged. And the Western powers don't like it being challenged. The root of the war in Ukraine, in my view, is the United States isn't going to be told what to do by anybody, including by Russia. So if the US wants to put missiles or military bases or NATO into Ukraine, no other country, this is explicit US doctrine, has the right to stop that, including Russia, which has a kind of concern because it's Russia's border, and Russia doesn't want the United States military on its border. So in this sense, all of this continues, and we see all sorts of manifestations of this in the war in Gaza as well, because Israel emerged out of British imperialism at the end of World War I, and the dominance of the British-US-Israel narrative about control of this region, which has two peoples, but one dominant power, Israel, and Palestine not having political rights, is still very much centered on the US-UK story. And this is what the war is about. Will there be political rights for both peoples after decades of abusive behavior by Israel, or will there be actually still this narrative that emerged already a century ago after the end of World War I by the British Empire? So we still see the long shadows of these views, and they're typically hidden from sight, but they're very powerful.
Thank you very much for that answer. Peter, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you the same question I briefly asked you when you were visiting CUHK a few months ago, and give you a little more time and thought to respond. So just to refresh your memory, there was this skit on the Daily Show years ago. Remember the Ground Zero Mosque was being built, and Fox News was fear-mongering about it, a lot of Islamophobic rhetoric. They're going to build a terror mosque. And the Daily Show was making fun of them because they pointed out that while they spent so much time on the funders of this terror mosque, they neglected to mention that one of the main funders was also a co-owner of News Corp. So they had two comedians come on, and one had a T-shirt saying Team Stupid, the other one said Team Evil. And they were trying to figure out if Fox News was just evil or stupid. Now, that kind of setup, that conceit, made me immediately think of the U.S. ruling class, or ruling classes around the world, but let's focus on the U.S.'s ruling class. So everybody believes that they're good. Everyone develops a sense of morality. Morality is kind of hard written into us to a certain extent. Outside of psychopaths who have a cognitive defect where they can't empathize. But I'm wondering, in your experience, you've swum in these circles of the blob in DC, and I'm wondering, what do you think? Is it Team Evil's explanation, which is, they understand in their own way the kind of basic realist story that the world is nasty and somebody's got to be the dominant player. Someone has to be the hegemon, the mafia don. And if it isn't the US, it's going to be somebody else who's worse. So we can commit all sorts of evil around the world because it's for the greater good of preventing an even worse evil. Or do you think it's mostly Team Stupid's explanation, which is that, the members of the U.S. ruling class, they go to the same universities, they their peers are similar, they're educated the same way, they read the same books, they use the same media outlets, but that information diet excludes arguments and evidence from other sides that would challenge their beliefs. So which of these two explanations do you lean toward, or do you think it's a mixture of both?
Well, I think it's in many ways the same, even as you've explained it. I think the view in the United States that the U.S. is the best for the world is actually felt. It's actually believed. Why? It's so peculiar. If you live outside the U.S., as I do much of the time, it's perfectly weird to think that. We're 4.1% of the world population. Don't you think the other 95.9% has something to say about their future?
Or a
So,
decent respect for the opinions of mankind, as in the Declaration of Independence?
yes, but the answer is no. We know better. Well, the French knew better, the British knew better, the Americans know better. So it's not restricted to the U.S. scene. I think there are many levels. I'm trying to figure out the answer to your question over many years. Also, we're hardwired that way. I'm convinced, in the sense that there are good evolutionary reasons to believe that what we call parochial altruism is a fact, which means, yes, you can be kind, beneficent, generous to the in-group, but to the out-group, that's an enemy. And I think we're probably quite well primed for that. It's one of the most decisive features of psychology, social psychology, that there is a difference between the in-group and the out-group, and that you can artificially create the out-group over almost anything. You tell kids you're blue or you're red in the morning. By afternoon, the red group hates the blue group, and the blue group hates the red group, and they're not playing games. They're not realists trying to play a game. They actually are now generating emotional input into how can we defeat the other side. So to my mind, it's pretty deep. How it works is complicated. I don't think anybody's really figured it out completely. I'm not in the inner sanctums of the blob most of the time, or very rarely. Though I know a lot of these people. Some are my students. Some, and maybe they're on the outer shell of the inner blob. I don't know, but I think that there are so many mechanisms of self-reinforcement, of self-glorification, that partly it is the media, the mainstream media, following the dictates from above, who pay the bills, who make the advertising, who have infiltrated the mainstream media anyway, literally with personnel from the CIA or other places over the years. We know this. Or it is the self-referencing, or it is to make your clientele comfortable, because no one likes to hear these things. So I think there are many mechanisms at work, just like the questions of how do ethics and morals and mores work in general. It's complicated, and sometimes it's pressure, sometimes it's deceit, sometimes it's cynicism, sometimes it's self-deception. I think all of those are somewhat at play, but it's hard to stand up against the establishment in general. And there's also a very famous line, and I meant to check out whether it's really Mark Twain or H.L. Mencken or both of them, but that you can't convince a person of something when his job depends on, or his income depends on, believing the opposite. And this also is true. People are dependent on going along. these structures are real. These structures of power are real.
But what I'm trying to say is that even this little country of mine, the Netherlands, is extremely at the forefront always to jump into or to help the U.S. and other European countries in their imperialist endeavors. They want to be the leader of the NATO. The recently Dutch soldiers were found in Lebanon, and I'm like, apartheid is a Dutch invention. It's a Dutch word. So I'm always saying that I feel it's much more Europe wide. Often there's this idea that the rest of Europe are vassal states of the United States, and I in a way I agree. But I think there's not a lot of difference between, for example, the UK's role in imperialism and countries like France or smaller countries like the Netherlands. I feel they all have a very active role when it comes to Western imperialism. What would you say about that?
Well, I think you're just being proud because if the British taught the Americans all that they know, the Dutch taught the British all that they know. After all, it was
Yeah.
it was the glorious revolution in 1688 that modernized Britain. This is a Dutch invention. The Netherlands was in the forefront of colonialism, imperialism, racism. But then it lost its military and naval dominance to Britain, but it still showed what it could do in Batavia, and the colony of today's Indonesia was very brutal. So this is indeed something that is European-wide. I think it's an interesting question historically, by the way, whether there is historically and ideologically a difference of Northern and Southern Europe in this regard. Southern Europe, Catholic Europe, was the first global imperialists, Spain and Portugal, and they lost out eventually to Northern Europe, to the Netherlands and to Britain especially, and to France. France is a little bit in between the Protestant Catholic divide, but there were a few checks, a little bit mild checks on this, coming from the Pope and Catholicism, not at the beginning, but by the 17th and 18th centuries. The Spanish decided that it was wrong to enslave the indigenous populations of the Americas, though not the African Americans, not the Africans. So it was a kind of mixed bag. In Northern Europe, there weren't too many scruples of that kind for a long time. Anyway, this is a footnote, but I would agree that this has been European-wide, and it manifests whoever is the dominant power. So the Netherlands was a great ocean power and a great imperial power up until the 17th century. It lost out to Britain after that. British dominance came in the 19th century because of the steam engine, basically, and military power that came with industrialization. And so I wouldn't say that it's distinctly cultural within Europe, but I would say that the dominant culture that we saw turned on which was the dominant power. France has had its civilizing mission. Britain did it in a different way. Each one that came to the fore was sure that God was on their side, that culture was on their side, that technology was on their side, and probably genes, when they discovered what genes were, or evolution was on their side. So I think each one has had its turn. But European dominance now is, real dominance is 250 years old, and European ascendance is 500 years old. And our cultures are deeply penetrated by those ideas. And we're living through this moment, especially with the rise of China, where this is coming to an end. So I think that this really is a long cycle. We happen to be observers of the moment when the whole thing is falling down. One might have said that at the end of World War II, with the end of the straightforward imperialism. But that was a long, drawn-out 40 years, 50 years war to end the direct European imperial rule. But the ideas didn't stop, and the U.S. does its empire in a different way. The U.S. Runs its empire mainly through regime change operations, and through military bases. So the U.S. has military bases in 80 countries, about 800 military bases around the world, and it overthrows governments regularly. And that's how it runs its empire, rather than directly having its place on the map. So we're still very much in the midst of this.
What are your thoughts about the situation about U.S. policy at the moment?
What I wrote in that article was not just about keeping peace, but keeping us away from the nuclear precipice. And I referred to what many people listening will know, the doomsday clock. The doomsday clock is the notional idea of measuring how close we are to nuclear annihilation. It was started by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in 1947 to alert the world that in the new atomic age, of course now we're in the thermonuclear age, we are capable of suicidal destruction of the planet in a way that wasn't true before 1945. And in 1947, these scientists and analysts of the global scene said we were 7 minutes till midnight, meaning that we were at the brink of nuclear war and nuclear annihilation. And of course, the idea was to keep us away from the brink. So what I looked at in that article was which presidents took us closer to midnight and which took us away from midnight. And it was very sobering to look at the clock from the American political point of view. Most American presidents have been failures, in my view, in foreign policy. Most have made the world more dangerous, not less dangerous. Most, of course, have presided over CIA campaigns to overthrow governments around the world. There have been perhaps 90 such regime change operations since 1947. They continue until this day. The U.S. foreign policy is based first and foremost on the principle, if you don't like your opponent, overthrow it, which is a very strange kind of diplomacy. Most diplomacy is, if you don't like your opponent, find out a way to live together, actually have diplomacy. Even compromise, a word that's a completely dirty word in our lexicon. It became, quote, appeasement. It became one model, which is compromise means death. This is the psychology. So never compromise, never agree with an adversary, only defeat or overthrow an adversary. This is what most presidents have done. We have had a few skilled presidents, and Eisenhower was one of them, although it's a complicated record because he was a fiscal conservative. He didn't want to spend a lot of money, so he thought literally you get a lot of bang for the buck with nuclear weapons. So he was part of the arms race, but he also understood that there needed to be an agreement with the Soviet Union. President Kennedy saved the world after almost stumbling into nuclear annihilation in 1961 in the Bay of Pigs CIA operation to overthrow the Cuban government. And then in 1962, the disaster on both sides of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union put in offensive nuclear weapons into Cuba, and we came the closest we've ever come to nuclear annihilation. But then Kennedy and his counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, were smart enough, human enough, decent enough, thoughtful enough, rational enough to pull us back from the brink and actually enter into what then became, for
years and even decades a nuclear arms control framework, starting with the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. Johnson put us closer to midnight again. Then Nixon, much reviled by me, by the way, in my youth, and by much of society, and of course forced to resign over Watergate, took us away from midnight through so-called détente in the early 1970s and his opening to China. And that was very clever. Jimmy Carter, who I liked as a president, contrary to much foreign policy, actually took us back towards midnight, to my chagrin, because we all learned decades after the fact and directly from the strategic author, the tactical author of this blunder, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was very proud of having assigned the CIA to run jihadists in Afghanistan, starting in 1979, with the idea of entrapping the Soviet Union in an Afghan invasion. So we created what became Al-Qaeda, what became the jihadist terrorism. This was a CIA op. Yes, it entrapped the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. It entrapped Afghanistan in what became more than 4 decades of U.S. completely created disaster. And it took the world back towards midnight. So Carter failed. The apogee of safety was Reagan and George Bush 1, because this was the end of the Cold War. We thought, didn't we? And this also, of course, was due to somebody who has a very mixed opinion. There's a very mixed opinion about him. I knew him. I actually worked for his economic team. I'm speaking of Mikhail Gorbachev. One thing I can tell you for certain is that Mikhail Gorbachev was a man of peace, which is absolutely remarkable. And unilaterally, he disbanded the Soviet military machine in Central and Eastern Europe, the so-called Warsaw Pact Alliance. And to their credit, both Reagan and Bush Sr. cooperated with Gorbachev relatively straightforwardly. And by the end of Bush Sr., we were 17 minutes from midnight. That means the farthest from nuclear war ever. But a funny thing happened on the way to peace, and that is the point of today, which is the U.S. could not take yes for an answer. We could not accept the idea of peaceful, mutually respectful, transparent cooperation with Russia. We just couldn't accept it. And by the way, what is fascinating looking back, it wasn't even about communism, which was the great bogeyman of the age. It was about Russia. Because as communism ended, as the Soviet Union ended, now we know, and this I think is the main point for our day, we know that as early as 1992, the goal, as expressed by then Defense Secretary Richard Cheney, who became perhaps the most influential single architect of American foreign policy for the next 20 years, was not only to end the Soviet threat or the communist threat, but to dismember Russia as well. Cheney's argument in 1992 was, well, the Soviet Union dissolved. Let's do the same with Russia. Russia can dissolve. And a very insightful way to understand this remarkably dangerous, bizarre, irresponsible, reckless idea is an article by Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the architects of all of this period, in 1997, in an essay in Foreign Affairs magazine called A Strategy for Eurasia. And Brzezinski just casually notes, maybe we need 3 Russias in a loose confederation, maybe a European Russia, maybe a Siberian Russia, maybe a Far East Russia. Together, yes, but in a loose confederation. The point of reading this is to think about the arrogance, the hubris of American foreign policy, that it's going to dismember Russia. And that, I believe, has been the more than 30-year campaign. Dismember, surround, regime change operation, you name it. But we've got Russia on the ropes. The Soviet Union went down because we defeated it, not because of Gorbachev, not because of peace, not because of making a cooperative offering, but because we are the unipolar power of the world. No one comes close. The greatest colossus in world history, greater than the Roman Empire. This is how American leaders thought back in the 1990s. We have a president who lives today in the 1990s, Biden. This is his formation. It may be his current mental apparatus for all I know, but it is his phraseology till today: the indispensable country, the sole superpower, the country that the whole world turns to for leadership. And the idea was, from the start, weaken, dismember, overthrow Russia. We are the sole superpower. So that's where NATO enlargement came in. That's where the U.S. support for jihadists around Russia's boundaries, whether in Chechnya or in the former Yugoslavia, came in, breaking apart Serbia in 1999 with the deliberate attempt to weaken a Russian ally, as well as to implant a NATO base in a, quote, new country, Kosovo. Oh, you're not supposed to change the map. The United States changed the map to have a NATO military base in Bondesteel and to break apart Serbia. 2002, withdraw from the ABM treaty unilaterally, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, put in Aegis missile systems in Poland and Romania starting in 2010, and of course, expand NATO to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Another Brzezinski project spelled out in 1997, stealing, as we've discussed in the past, from Lord Palmerston's ideas of the 1850s. Some ideas, some horrible ideas never die, and this one was brought back to life. But the point, Alexander, is that the presidents from Clinton onward, every single one, Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, and Biden, every single one has moved us closer to midnight in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Doomsday Clock. And we are now 90 seconds to midnight. Are you kidding? 90, they're trying to tell us something, and it's true. And if you don't hear it from the Doomsday Clock, just listen to any stupid European politician these days, because one is more stupid than the next. Let's taunt Russia. Let's provoke Russia. Of course, let's bomb Russia. Let's destroy Russia, says the big Baltic state presidents that want to bring us to nuclear disaster. One after the other makes no rational sense at all. Biden is adrift. He can't lead. So we are, as I have been thinking, with a stuck rudder heading towards the precipice, heading towards midnight, if you will, in the Doomsday Clock metaphor. And every day is bringing us closer, because we have a three-front conflict right now, not one of which is being tamped down. We have Ukraine, we have the Middle East, and it's not only Israel's crazed and genocidal assault in Gaza. It's Israel's continuing attacks on Iran to bring the United States into a war with Iran. Good idea, Israel. Now we need hear today, even from the New York Times, no less, it's Israel's fake bot campaign on social media to continue to influence U.S. Congress. We don't even need to know about the fake social accounts because the Israel lobby is powerful enough that it has held Congress in its thrall all this period. And we have the third front in Asia. As if it isn't enough, we are absolutely talking every day now. We have politicians, these are grown-ups, at least in appearance and by birth date, talking about war with China. So this is a kind of collective insanity. And incidentally, you know, I had an interview with Tucker Carlson recently, and it generates a lot of viewers and a lot of mail. And I got one just before we started from Germany saying that, Professor Sachs, I enjoyed your interview, but you expressed a little bit of puzzlement about what is Germany doing and why is it so self-destructive and so forth. And then it went into a very intelligent discussion about how Germany and every country where this gentleman has worked in academia is completely under the U.S. mystique and U.S. thrall and U.S. influence peddling and U.S. money and military industrial complex. So he says completely impossible in the continental European context to say anything in academia that is against the United States. I don't have that direct sense, but it's shocking because I always thought, and again, I'm a naive guy, it takes me a long time to understand these things, but I thought Europe's the sophisticated one. 2,000 years of history. Europe's got the diplomacy. Europe's seen everything. It's done everything. It understands everything. But what I'm hearing from a lot of people is that there's no real debate anywhere in continental Europe right now. And we know in Britain, I always say Britain taught America everything it knows about all of this, all of this danger and saber rattling and wars of choice. And here we are. So 5 presidents in a row carrying us closer to nuclear annihilation than ever, and an American political system utterly and completely incapable of addressing this right now. Elections don't matter in November. This is something beyond the elections. This is something about the mentality, about the scale of the military-industrial complex, about the depth of these long-term projects, about the special role of the CIA in American society, because almost surely the most powerful institution in the land and the least known and least understood by design. And interestingly, just one last point of the rant, and sorry to carry on, but you know, when there's a real negotiation in the Middle East, when you really need to sit down to talk with Hamas, who goes from the United States? Not Blinken, but Burns, the CIA director. This is not an incidental point. What the hell is the CIA director doing negotiating this arrangement? The CIA is supposed to be an intelligence agency. Of course, we know it's a secret army, but it's amazing to see that. CIA director should not be the negotiator. But the CIA director is the negotiator because that's the real power in the American system right now.
Now we're talking about, launching missiles inside of Russia. The Russians, again, showing incredible self-discipline in the face of all of this. And they're winning the war in Ukraine. I think this is now generally accepted outside, some cartoonish articles that you still sometimes find in parts of the British media. Are we going to go on escalating? What is the point where we stop? Is it? Are we going to stop at nuclear weapons? I mean, where are we going to stop? Because for the moment, actually, despite all that we've been saying, I think the Russians have shown incredible ability to absorb our provocations and to keep up their side, what they want to do. But we are escalating continuously. Putin has talked about unending escalation. Is there a point where this escalation stops, given that people in the West are now talking about the war in Ukraine crazily in existentialist terms, that the West is apparently now at risk if Kiev falls.
Yeah, I think you've been making the point completely correctly, both of you, that there has not been one point where the West has stopped an escalation that it promised not to take. And the most recent, of course, is this rather pitiful debate: can NATO weapons be used to hit inside Russia? And every single line that's been drawn on which missile systems, which weapon systems, and so forth, the boots on the ground now with Macron and completely out of line of any sense, sending the French troops formally. There hasn't been a line where we have said, well, we said we wouldn't do it and we're not going to do it. That is the point up until now. The escalation has continued because the dominant drama is we cannot be stopped from our purpose. Our purpose is Ukraine in our territory, NATO in Ukraine. We can't concede that because then the whole world, the whole house of cards falls down, is the idea. So it's a kind of domino theory, the theory we can't stop in Vietnam because then the whole free world will collapse. It was nonsense then, nonsense now. I always like to refer to the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, AD 9, when the Romans learned that they had a limit. The limit was Germania, it was the Rhine. They couldn't conquer Germania. You know, the Roman Empire didn't fall that day in AD 9. Augustus more or less said, okay, enough with this. we stopped this particular project of heading east. It's almost the same story now. Nothing of any significance in this world, nothing, not even for Ukraine, would be detrimentally affected by Biden picking up the phone today and saying to Putin, you know, that idea of NATO and Ukraine, that was pretty harebrained. It's not going forward. Then the war stops today. Yeah, there's some details, but this is the essence of it from the start. From the start. From 30 years or 60 years ago, depending on when you want to date this particular misadventure. But so far, no break at all because they don't understand Teutoburg Forest. They don't understand that it's not the end of the world for the U.S. not to have NATO in Ukraine and Georgia, not exactly two North Atlantic countries, not exactly defending against the Soviet Union, which doesn't even exist anymore, not exactly in line with the promises given solemnly and repeatedly and in writing and verbally to Gorbachev in 1990, and everyone can look it up on the National Security Archives of George Washington University if you have any doubt, by James Baker III and by Hans Dietrich Genscher, foreign minister of Germany in 1990. We will not move 1 inch eastward. So this is really the question. And by the way, as you discussed on your shows, and I got one of the most harrowing emails that I've ever received by one of America's most esteemed scientists, engineers, and experts in nuclear missile systems and early warning systems when the two radars were hit by Ukrainian drones inside Russia. These radars that were, you know, partly damaged, probably not decisively, but key parts of the Russian early warning nuclear attack systems. And I got from this really very top expert the biggest alarm email that I've received in recent times. And it basically said, believe me, Jeff, the people in the White House and the State Department do not understand the technical side of this. And then he sent me lots of pictures that I didn't understand about what Russia can see over the horizon, given its early warning systems compared to what the U.S. sees, and how extraordinarily dangerous these hits were on these radar systems. And asked me, I said, what should I do? Should I forward it to the White House, to the National Security Council, to Blinken, to others? Said, yes, 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 they don't understand what is going on. And I did that. Of course, you don't hear back, but I don't want to hear back, and I don't expect to hear back. But we don't have limits, but more than that, the Ukrainians certainly don't have limits. And one of the things I discovered, by the way, which is pretty interesting and pretty weird, if you go back to the early CIA running of these extremist Nazi and then neo-Nazi units, the Banderistas and others, back in the 1940s, the slogans that they used are the same slogans that are being used right now. Literally, I was shocked. One of the slogans is, "We are fighting for all of Europe." Because even the CIA back in the 40s was shocked at Bandera's brutality because they were mass murderers. They murdered the Poles, they murdered the Jews, they murdered everybody, and they were shocked. Incidentally, by the way, MI6 was not so shocked. MI6 had more professionalism. What's a little mass murder among friends? These are our buddies. The United States, the CIA was a little bit more reserved there. These really are friends. But the slogans that were being used, we're fighting for your freedom, we're fighting for Europe, they're really recycled, some of them. It's worth a historian actually doing this, because some of these slogans never really go away.
Absolutely. Very last point, which is that I completely agree that the United States has taken an awful lot of its ideas from Britain, 19th century Britain, including the rhetoric, by the way. If you read the rhetoric and the kind of articles that appeared in the 19th century British media and compare them with what you hear today, the resemblance is absolutely uncanny. But the British did have limits. They did understand that sometimes it made sense to retreat. They retreated from Sudan, they retreated from Afghanistan, they did those sort of things. They were prepared to do that, and they were prepared also to come to terms. They came to a very cynical and cruel agreement with the Russians to divide Iran into spheres of influence in 1907. But, they did it. They understood negotiations. They understood diplomacy at that time. What is astonishing about the United States is that it doesn't do even that. It's learned all the worst lessons from its teacher, but none of the good ones, which the British did have.
It's fascinating. I think part of it is the hubris of the nuclear age without understanding the other side has nuclear weapons. So not to rehash that, but the mindset in 1992, or the mindset of the Project for a New American Century at the end of the 1990s, that there's never been a power like the United States in history. So don't tell us about Teutoburg Forest, Roman Empire. What are they? They're nothing compared to what we are. So the hubris of it is something absolutely shocking. What also is interesting, we have our, as you've discussed and we've discussed together, we have our neocon family, the Kagan family. This is Kagan, Robert Kagan, and Victoria Nuland, and the Frederick Kagan, and the American Enterprise Institute, and the Institute for the Study of War. It's a family that has been the family of the military-industrial complex. The daddy was a professor at Yale, and the kids are the neocons. The father was brought along into this Project for a New American Century at the end of the 1990s, but he has a book about war that was his course at Yale, and it's actually in the introduction, he talks specifically about leaders who understand limits as being crucial for the survival of their states. And he gives special praise to Rome under Augustus and Hadrian for understanding the limits. He gives special praise to Bismarck for understanding that Germany didn't need colonies, Germany didn't need an arms race with Britain. And he talks about the excesses that then go on when these breaks are degraded, and you get the megalomaniacs or the drifters or the mentally incompetent or whatever it is in power. And the kids don't understand the dad because he actually studied wars, and he said limits. He was not in favor of all these wars. So it's very, very interesting. But we've lost it right now, and I keep thinking naively, well, the break will come from Europe, but no. Okay, I'm being disabused of that. The break is not going to come from inside the United States anytime soon. We are probably in this extraordinarily dangerous, fraught situation where at least some rational people who can make calculations will have to somehow tell their bosses, stop. We actually cannot do what we're saying we're doing. And maybe the steady hand of, or maybe the countervailing pressure of the BRICS or the 150 countries in the UN that are not exactly in favor of this Western adventurism, somehow this will be our lucky moment that a break is put on.